name is Heather Shea Gasser. I am your host from Michigan State University. As I said, tonight we are broadcasting live from the ACPA convention in Tampa, Florida. But we typically host a live show every other Wednesday at 12 Eastern Time on higheredlive.com. So I invite you to look for future episodes there. And if you've never watched our show before, you could go to higheredlive.com where you can find a link to other Student Affairs Live episodes. For those of you who are joining us live today on the internet, please follow along on the back channel with the hashtag higheredlive and ACPA15. Thanks to Joe Denise, who will be monitoring today's back channel and bringing me questions on the stage on cue cards. And for those of you who are in the audience, if you have questions, please approach a microphone. Together with my Student Affairs Live co-host, Tony Duty from Rutgers University, I'd like to express thanks to all those who make this show possible. Higher Ed Live is produced by Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. Student Affairs Live is also exclusively sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. ACPA's strategic partnership with Higher Ed Live calls attention to the pairing of innovative professional development delivery with the strength of a renowned professional association. Tony and I are deeply grateful for their sponsorship, which has enabled us to deliver 3 live shows to you during this convention, which you can find recordings of on our website. So with the show. So this evening, we have an incredible opportunity to have a great conversation with 2 powerhouses in higher education assessment and student engagement, research, and scholarship, Dr. George Kuh and Dr. Jillian Kinzie. So a little bit about both of them. Jillian Kinsey works as the Associate Director of NESE, or the National Survey of Student Engagement, and Coordinator of the NESE Center for Post-Secondary Research. She coordinates the NESE Institute project activities, documents effective educational practice, and facilitates the use of student engagement data. She managed the Documenting Effective Education Practices, or DEEP project, and the Building Engagement and Attainment of Minority Students, or BEAMS, and also serves as a senior scholar on the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, which I imagine we'll be hearing a lot about this evening, which is an initiative to study assessment in higher education and assist institutions and others in discovering and adopting promising practices in assessment of college student learning outcomes. She has co-authored numerous publications, including Student Success in College, Creating Conditions That Matter, Continuity and Change in College Choice, National Policy, Institutional Practices, and Student Decision-Making, and the second edition of One Size Does Not Fit All, Traditional and Innovative Models of Student Affairs Practice. She serves as the co-editor of the New Directions in Higher Education series and is on the editorial board of ACPA's Journal of College Student Development, as well as the Journal of Learning Community Research. George Kuh is currently an adjunct research professor at the University of Illinois and Chancellor's Professor Emeritus of Higher Education at Indiana University in Bloomington. He directs the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, which is co-located at the University of Illinois and Indiana University. He founded the National Survey of Student Engagement, or NESE. He has over 375 publications and has given several hundred presentations on topics related to institutional improvement, college student engagement, assessment strategies, and campus cultures. His recent books include Using Evidence of Student Learning to Improve Higher Education, Ensuring Quality and Taking High-Impact Practices to Scale, High-Impact Practices, and Student Success in Colleges, Creating Conditions That Matter. He has consulted with more than 350 institutions of higher education and educational agencies in the United States and abroad, and he was recognized by ACPA in 1986 with the Contribution to Knowledge Award and in 2006 with the Lifetime Achievement Award. So I'm really grateful to you both for joining me tonight. Our show tonight is about student engagement, which may be the key to unlocking college student success. So my first question has to do with the book that I mentioned earlier, Creating Conditions That Matter, Student Success in College. And I wanted to specifically talk about this definition of a successful student that you referenced in the book, where you say that a successful student is defined as one who persists, benefits in desired ways from their experiences while in college, persists to graduation, and is ultimately satisfied with their college experience. I'm curious, given the changing conditions in our economy, as well as pressures from the workforce and government relations, how do we demonstrate our institutional commitments to student success?
Thanks, Heather. I'd love to take that, and I'm just so impressed that you actually quoted directly from the book. That means she actually read it, which is fabulous.
I don't remember reading.
Yes, we had an explicit definition. And, you know, I think the definition holds, and it might suggest what we need to do to demonstrate the outcomes. For example, you know, I mean, if student success is about persistence, we need to demonstrate what it is that we're doing to promote persistence. So as an institution. The other element is that students are benefiting in some ways that are important. We need to know exactly what students are gaining from their college education and where and how. We also need to know that they're satisfied. That's one of the lesser things for me, but there's an element of satisfaction that is motivating them and helping them stay in college and ensuring that they stick around long enough to experience. And then there's also this final outcome that is so important about graduation. And we need to know exactly what's, you know, in this case, facilitating progress in graduation. So we need to be more clear about what's contributing to those important outcomes. So at least from an institution's perspective, the more they can demonstrate what it is that they're doing to foster all of those important outcomes, that's one very specific goal as that an institution, I think, needs to tend to. The other element, I think, that I would add to that is really being more clear as an institution, what is aligned with those goals? So what are the things you're doing as an institution? And if there are things you're doing that aren't aligned with those things, then we need to think about whether that's worth doing.
Right. Absolutely. George, any additional thoughts?
Just to elaborate on three things that Jillian mentioned, all of which obviously I agree with, because that's apparent with the definition. So, but you know, you mentioned satisfaction, and none of us, I hope, thinks of our role as creating an additional extended summer camp. This is not primarily about giving students everything they say they want and or need, but on the other side of that is, and we know from our research efforts, that satisfaction does not itself directly contribute to the outcomes of effort, but it is indirectly related to whether students will stay. And if students don't stay, then they're less likely to get the things we're after. And we emphasize also not just persistence, because even though that is important, you got to persist, but you got to persist to graduate. The finishing of what we start, the credential, the degree it's not just a matter of personal attainment, but when you look at, and let's be concrete about this, how much money people make. People who fall even just 3 or 6 credits short. I mean, that's not the way the world should be, but it is a marker. It's the single, as the Ernie Pasquarello, Pat Teranzini said 20 years ago now, it's the single most important demarcation in terms of the economic run. So just to highlight those couple.
Back to the student satisfaction piece for just a second. I'm curious about how kind of a consumer culture then impacts the way we deliver educational experiences. I just read an article in one of my classes that talks about students as consumers. And does satisfaction mean that they're consumers, or, you know, and what do we do about that in terms of educational outcomes?
Well, students have always been consumers.
Sure.
You know, whenever we started charging
they're paying
tuition,
money. Exactly.
So they're consumers. But we know what that mentality means. It's really a turn on the notion that people come to college, people seek university education because of they love the idea of the mind, of truth, of seeking knowledge for its own sake. This is a long-standing article of faith, especially among the faculty. And if you read the history of higher education as you have, it's never quite been that way in the United States. People went off to college all right, in large part because their parents either didn't want them home anymore, or they were going to be clergy people. And then, of course, I'm not going to get the history lesson here, but the point is we have always been about providing people something that was of value, both personal value, but of monetary. I don't mean lots of money, but certainly enough to make one's way after college. So, but there's so much going on in the external world about the consumer always being right, that it has, I think, if not corrupted, it's certainly shaped a lot of the things that we do. Let's get a higher climbing wall. Let's be sure that there are now not 2 but 17 food stations serving. Now, I'm not opposed to that necessarily, but if it drives the cost up, then we have another issue. Of course, we know how critical cost is to how sensitive people are.
We'll definitely need to talk about that, I think, at some point. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, Jeff Salingo has talked quite a lot about this in general in his role as the editor of the Chronicle, but also in his book, College Unbound, about how the driving costs and how a lot of that has to do with increasing amenities, of which many of us in student affairs oversee, work with, design, and maybe the learning outcomes piece is the key to creating relevance for those activities.
I sure hope so, because it shouldn't be about building a bigger climbing wall or a more palatial center for whatever we want to create on campus. I think the engagement and learning emphasis is the key to unlocking this kind of emphasis on, or perhaps overemphasis on concern about the consumer or their satisfaction, is that we need to attract students to this idea that this is what you'll gain from this experience. It's not enough just to be satisfied and think about the things that are driving your education. There's so much more here that you need to leave with that ultimately is more important for your lifelong learning skills.
And your future career, potentially, as well. Yeah. So many of you both have many years of research and study about student engagement. Can you talk about the 3 factors, maybe come up with 3? I sent you the questions ahead of time, so.
No, I've never seen these questions before.
We haven't talked about 3 factors that have the greatest impact on student success in college.
And of course, we spoke.
Yeah,
So
like
we're
you
all
talk about those.
that's
Yeah.
I'm taking the lead on this one.
Okay.
All right, and so I'm going to start with something that sounds facetious, but it is unfortunately true. Choosing one's parents wisely
Which we all have choice over.
makes a huge difference in terms of the likelihood that you'll go and succeed in college. And so that is, the data are just uncompromising. In fact, knowing the zip code of the high school pretty much wipes out almost everything else in terms of the chance of the odds of college. So of course I'm being facetious about that. That's not something over which an individual has control. So we've spent, a lot of us are spending a fair amount of time these days talking about HIPS, high impact practices, something that we discovered and helped develop a label for by our friends at AAC&U. But in addition to the list of 10, the officially approved list, as I like to call it, I think it represents something that we know from the literature, and that is when a student becomes committed to, involved in something that takes substantial, almost an enormous amount of time relative to the other things they do, and they do that over an extended period of time. It is those kinds of activities that put a claim on students. And typically when students do that, we've got a bump in satisfaction because they're doing things that you don't stick with something for a long period of time that you're not, or you aren't going to figure out how to gain some satisfaction from. So I'm very bullish, have been for a long time, on trying to channel students into something that, and then that kind of channeling, typically these are not independent, solitary activities. So the other thing I will mention is who you choose or who you end up in terms of a peer affinity. These are people who are going to buoy you in the bad times, and it has a downward spiral across the country because you get stuck with the wrong person. Because your friends end up have an unreasonably high amount of influence on how you spend your time, who you'll take classes from, how much you'll study, and so forth and so on. And the last thing I'll say, and I don't mean in order of importance necessarily, these kind of depend on individuals, is having somebody that believes that you can do this. This could come from peers, it could come from a coach, it could come from an advisor, a special faculty member, or the residence hall. I mean, a lot of people can play that role, and getting connected, having that luxury, that benefit of being connected to somebody like that can bail you out of a lot of tough kind of interpersonal times that can maybe helping you ride through the bumps. It could be a parent, it could be a sibling, but if we think about on campus and that's why there's such a big push these days to try to get more peer mentors involved, assigning faculty advisors who might in fact be teaching that first year lot of ways that we can maybe artificially structure that so it happens. But ultimately, it's got to be an authentic relationship.
Yeah, I just would echo those same things. I think this final emphasis on the importance of relationships with peers and doing that relationship with peers, with other adults on campus, and with with faculty, and it has to be around substantive matters. So we have to create conditions and contexts for students to be able to have rich conversations and rich experiences with others. And it should, I really want learning to be at the core of most of those experiences, because that's where students can get intensely involved in what it is that they need to be successful at when they're in college. The only other thing I would add to that too is that I think we want experiences to be rich in diversity too. And I mean that in the broadest sense, that we want students to be able to experience things that take them out of their comfort zone, that take them into places where they have to think differently about what they thought about that, and that they have to apply what they're learning and what they thought about that in a totally different context. So mixing it up a bit and helping students move to these different kinds of contexts, and I think that's why things like service learning and other contexts that take students out of perhaps their comfort zone are important. And they may seem unsettling at first, but they're critical to student success and learning.
Yeah, sure, especially if there's a built-in reflection component. Right? Yeah. And I think with the peer piece, I work in the living learning community at Michigan State University, and we see if we create the conditions within that environment where students can support one another, tie what they're learning in the classroom back to what they're doing within the community, and there's a lot of that in the learning communities that are on your list.
They are a high impact practice.
They are.
I just want to say that I would have said what Jillian said, but I can only choose 3.
Like round out.
Very good. So I'm curious back to this idea of engagement and learning. Engagement is defined by various offices across campus. When you think about land-grant institutions, engagement with community organizations can really be a different term. The office engagement and outreach, is kind of what I'm thinking about. At Michigan State University, we have engagement centers. Some of the students in my program, we told them to visit the engagement center and take a photo. They facetiously took pictures of engagement rings. We're like, so there's so many definitions, but we really need to, I think, articulate what we mean by engagement and how that directly relates to learning. So, could you start maybe with talking about how you define engagement?
Yeah. I mean, I actually looked at the program for this conference and to see how many different times engagement is used, and there was the one interesting term, entity engagement, that was actually in the titles of some staff and ACPA and member engagement and all of these roles that now have this term engagement in them. So I was struck by how much that word is getting used. And I mean, I think it's right. I mean, there are lots of contexts to use this. Engagement in learning. And engaged learning is a very particular term that is used more frequently in K-12 education to signify students' engagement with the material and their sense of intense involvement with the content. That's an engaged learner. And, that's sort of what we're talking about in higher ed, but it's much more about the things that we know matter for students' education and their engagement in those things. So it's a broader conception than what I think is actually used quite frequently in K-12 education. But then we have all these other forms of engagement, civic engagement and community engagement, and it starts to really get confusing, I think. And, I'm not really into the whole, let's lay out the territory and use the precise definition and, really be so specific about that. That doesn't allow for other kind of ways in. But I do think when we're talking about what it is that we're after, student engagement is very different than being civically engaged, and we should be clear about what kind of engagement we're talking about. But student engagement to me still has the broadest sense of these are things that matter for learning. We know when students do these things, they're learning, they're going to learn more, they're going to be more likely to persist and graduate. So it is a pretty broad definition.
So as a follow-up to that, I'd ask for you to just give us a brief overview. I know you were involved in developing it, but how does the National Survey of Student Engagement, or the NSE, measure this? How do colleges and universities utilize NSE?
You should ask the people who probably know more about it than I do. But I got to say this. You mentioned your students, your colleagues taking pictures of engagement rings.
Yes.
when we first started what became known as NESI, we did some focus groups early on. We were still field testing, and some of the stuff came back. Well, I didn't fill it out because I'm not engaged to be married. And we actually changed the name of the survey for a year. What was actually on the survey was called the College Student Report. Beyond, but then it became clear to us that no one was reading the name of the survey, really. So we went back to NESI. Well, NESI is based on, as Jillian's already alluded, based on decades of research. And there was a group of people that came together, a thing called the design team, which was led by Peter Hewell. I mean, there's a long backstory to this, but the point is, we had people in the room, Sandy Aston, who had been directing CERT for 25 years, other people who had been doing work about collecting data from students, and they had pretty good analytics about what was related to what. And then you had the folklore of American higher education. Student-faculty interaction, gotta be good. One of the things we found out of years of NESI is, yes, student-faculty interaction is positively related, but not necessarily the amount. So it's not just how much time you spend. We've seen some data showing that the frequency, that is the first year students who have the most frequent contact with their faculty are a little less satisfied than their peers. And that's probably because they are spending a fair amount of time talking with faculty because their performance is poor. What does this thing in the margin mean? And I've got to revise this paper again. So we did not make this out of whole cloth. I'll say a word about engagement as you were talking about the lexicon. I've never done this, but I suspect that if you would go back to 1995, 1980, you would not see the word engagement, at least not in the marketplace of higher education. You'd find it certainly in these broader forms. And so I think what NESI did, and NESI intentionally cultivated this, we wanted to get this into the water supply. It was an antidote or a partial counterpoint to what U.S. News was doing by focusing on resources and the reputation of an institution. We knew what the research showed, thanks to Sandy Aston and Ernie Pascarella and countless others, that doing the things that matter, as Gillian said, would likely lead to higher forms of attainment. I'll just say the other thing about engagement is what engagement represents as a term, both with NESI and most of the other forms that you've just mentioned, is, as I said earlier, a fair amount of effort required on the part of the people doing whatever it is, community engagement, something else, and an extended period of time. So it's great if you want to go out and pick up cans on the side of the road for 2 hours one morning, which is something that some groups will do. But that's not where the payoff is, right? You got to have something that people will sustain effort at, and as you said, and we want to come back to this probably, where there's a reflective component, so that it's not just time spent, something else is happening intrapersonally.
Yeah, I think that piece is really critical, and when I talk with students who haven't yet done that, you can tell it was a very surfacey experience. No deep lived learning happened, and when I think about the student experiences that were most formative in my education 20-some years ago, it was those that I had the opportunity to sit down with my peers or with a faculty member or with a mentor or a research assistant or something and really talk about what that meant for me and what the impact that it would have on my future. So I think that's important. So when you look at the NESI data, how do campuses make sense of it, use it, integrate changes to their programs and designs as a result of having received the results?
Yeah, this is my favorite thing to talk about. Yeah, we can talk about the survey, and it's I can certainly talk about the questions we ask and why we ask the questions, but to me, the most important thing is what do you do with the results? It's supposed to be diagnostic for a campus. So the idea is that if you're asking students to report on the things that we know matter for learning, and you come to find out at your institution, students are doing that significantly less than students at comparable peer institutions. At the very least, that should cause you at least to take pause and say, I wonder why that's the case. Or to say, oh my gosh, what are we doing here? So that's an important element. So it has this diagnostic quality to it that's supposed to help a campus reflect on, are we doing the things that we know matter for learning and development? And then you can tease out and say, all right, well, if we layer onto that or examine first, what do we claim to be about? We claim to be a public liberal, or let's say a liberal arts college that really places a strong emphasis on student-faculty interaction. This is a place where you can expect to get a lot of mentoring, a lot of feedback from faculty, and you look at all of those items that ask for that kind of reporting out by students and don't see your students' experience reflected in that way, then there might be some serious concern raised on the campus. So it's designed to help motivate action, reflection. That's the idea. And it's also designed for institutions to know, what are we doing well? So to emphasize the strengths, to be able to feel confident saying, this is the place we designed, and we are achieving those. It goes back to your first question about how do institutions demonstrate that they're committed to student success and that they're actually making a contribution. Well, one of it is having some evidence that you're actually doing these things. So that's important.
So I'm curious because I know we've talked a lot about kind of in-class formal learning opportunities. What about the formative experiences that happen out of class? I know Nessie doesn't necessarily get into that in the same level, but how does the social, physical, and other spiritual student development happen outside of the classroom? What role does that play in student success? Maybe we could talk about that a little bit. And are there ways to assess that as well? And I think about what we do in student affairs. A lot of it isn't as measurable in some ways. So I don't know if you have.
Oh, yes, the ineffable outcomes of college, the things that are, as I've used the term before today, articles of faith. Well, it's one of those things where you know it when you either feel it or see it. But you ask, what role does it play? Well, it may be the most important. I mean, what we're doing with the Nessie tool, and just to remind us that something that probably doesn't need to be said, it's one tool. It does not purport to measure everything of value. So what it does measure are things that institutions can do something about. In the areas you're now talking about, it is more difficult, I think, to directly address spiritual development. Now, that doesn't mean institutions don't do that. And we can see some very fascinating breakpoints when we look at Nessie data. We have a couple of items. I don't know if they still out there. Wash them out. I think they maybe washed out. Oh, that's too bad. Some of them are gone. But in the olden days, when we had an item on spiritual development, and it turns out that the more time students spend thinking about spirituality and going to those kinds of events, both kind of formal religion and informal, if you will, there was the one outcome, self-reported outcome, a deepened sense of spirituality right through the roof. So there was this one-to-one relationship. No surprise. This is what.
Probably why you took it off of the.
Yeah, you're going to make a case for its return.
Well, but you don't ask the question you know the answer to, right? Okay, you do this, you're going to get more.
Yes,
right?
that's right. Yes.
I really wanted to go to institutional ethos. I mean, that's really what I wanted to say. There are places where that is a great emphasis. Places, they stand on it, and you can see, even with some of the rudimentary tools we have, you can see differences in terms of how students experience their university life from other institutions that don't have that same emphasis. But on the point, we have many other tools. You know more about them today than I do. That are measuring identity, different forms of identity for different populations. One of the issues there, of course, is that they're not used, we'll say universally, or you don't see the use over hundreds of institutions. And so what you don't have with, typically, I stand to be corrected, are what we would call benchmarks. Right? You don't have the comparative data to say, are we getting as much done here as we thought compared to what other institutions are doing? So that's a limitation only in that surreal world where statistics matter. The world you're talking about is the real world where people are authentically experiencing their life in the university with other people. And so almost every institution claims to value holistic development. But when you look at how we do our teaching and learning and what we do ask students to reflect about, oftentimes we fall pretty well short there.
I think that's the critical crux. And I think the other point is framing what Nessie does, institutionally is different than what it does at the individual
Yes,
Absolutely.
And the other instruments, that are talking about, at the individual level, what can we do with one-on-one students, or what are the factors that are impacting individuals' success as well.
I mean, there are some items that I think for academic advising
Sure.
purposes, and we generated tools to get academic advisors information about stuff. The student spends, I spend about 3 hours a week preparing for class. Well, that student ought to know that the rest of his or her peers are actually at 12 or 14 or more. So, but there are ways to use those in productive, real-time ways with students to think about what they're doing.
And we need to be measuring and understanding our effectiveness around all these dimensions that we claim is important. I don't want to go obsessive and crazy here, but really, we at least need to know as an institution how we're doing around that. And as we've said here, NESI is one tool. It's not, it is a blunt instrument. It is going to give an institution a picture of their students' engagement in the practices we know matter for learning. It doesn't cover everything. So there needs to be a whole suite of things.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned earlier in the earlier session, CAS. There's another kind of direct way to utilize the CAS standard, looking at learning and development.
I'd love to see more direct measures of what students are learning. Let's start assembling evidence of students' demonstration of these skills, either through a performance or through a presentation or through their leadership experience. It's really, there should be a whole array of things that we invite students to do and to represent what they've learned and how they've developed and grown.
Maybe there are these things, but different template for kind of evaluating how well a leader runs a student organization.
Right.
Individual meetings across the semester or year long. That would be kind of fun. And that drives us toward the proficiency you were talking about in the earlier.
Yeah, there are some beautiful resources that many professional organizations have developed around competencies.
Sure.
We ought to be drawing from that and thinking about how in student programming and student activities we do this, and how is that different than what we do in residential life or in recreation, which has its own whole, wonderful identification of learning outcomes and what campus deployment contributes in recreation contributes to those skills. That's the kind of work. It excites me to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other question I wanted to talk a little bit about is, we just talked about the DQP, talking about other instruments and other tools. And for the folks who are watching the show online, they didn't get to hear your previous talk about the degree qualifications profile. Can you give us a brief overview of that, and then how this maybe there's some overlaps and connections between what we do around student engagement, NESI, and then why student affairs should care about the DQP and its implementation on their campuses. Overview of the DQP.
Okay, so first we have a visual aid.
Yes.
So for those of you watching at home, you can actually really dig into this right now.
Download it.
Yeah, so
And
this
if
is
you order now,
widely available.
Degree profile.
It's completely free, it's high gloss, and there's some wonderful resources. So the learningoutcomes.org is the official website, but the DQP, if you just Google that, it's, I'll just say that, kind of the two things that really stand out for me. One is the degree qualifications profile it's claims to be a learning-centered framework. It gives us a profile of what a degree should represent. This is what it should be about. But for me, it's about being clear about expressing what it is that we want students to do, be able to know and do as a result of their college education. So, that's plain and simple what it is. It's a beautifully articulated vision of what we want students to be able to know and do.
it is that. I was just thinking for a moment about John Holland's self-directed search. Is that still being used?
The Holland Code is still out there.
Does anybody know what I'm talking about? So, but that tool, along with other kinds of career planning devices, can be misinterpreted to mean once you fill it out and you get the answer, this is what you're going to do. And it's really intended to get people to think more deeply about who they are and what they want to do and the options that are available. The DQP serves kind of a similar purpose. I don't think anybody expects an institution to take that literally, place it on top of their curriculum, and make sure they're shoving courses and co-curricular experiences so that it's filled out. That would be a technical exercise, but it wouldn't represent the realities, the multiple realities that we provide. So it is an effort for us, and as we did say in the earlier session, we are well behind people elsewhere in the world more clearly defining what a person should know and be able to do to qualify for a degree. That is to actually have met the standards, if you will, that we've established. And I don't mean universal standards or national standards. I mean the standards that an individual institution has established. Very few institutions have met that test.
Well, I think one of the complicated factors is when you say I have a college degree, what does that mean? And I think employers want to know that, so there's lots of stakeholders in this type of instrument going into production and use. Especially
when so many of us have a degree.
Yes.
So today, the employers, at least the people that I've spoken with, everybody's got a degree, so I know you've got a degree. Now I want you to tell me in your own words what that degree represents. What did you learn? And equally important, how have you used it? And now the kicker, how do you see yourself using it here?
Talk with me a little bit about how faculty maybe have to work with the DQP or have used it on their campuses. I mean, you gave the example before from Utah State University, I believe. It'd be interesting to hear, what were faculty's role in helping develop it, and then how do they use it? Maybe do they adapt their curriculum? Do you have any pushback? Like, how does that?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that more?
Yeah.
Well, I'll take the first wave at this, and Jillian can fill in and clarify that. So it is all those things. So 4 people were encouraged to sit in the room until they agreed, and they're well known. Peter Ewell and Carol Schneider, the president of ACU, both of them having been faculty members, no longer available, and having been a faculty member, then spending 20 years in the Department of Ed, looking at hundreds of thousands of transcripts and so on. And Paul Gaston, who was the consummate English professor, having served as provost, he still teaches. He will not miss his Friday afternoon seminar, and I don't mean that's kind of what a week he actually does, an academic seminar on Friday afternoon. So these were the people who drafted the first edition. So how do faculty respond? Well, it depends. I mean, most have to be sold on the need to take a closer look at how we are delivering the curriculum. You're asking about faculty, so I'm specifically referring to the curriculum. We do this on the co-curricular side, if you wish. And typically, there is something going on, or at best, there's something going on at the institution that has made doing this kind of examination worthwhile. It might be the regional accrediting group is coming. It might be we have a series of program reviews underway that we internally do periodically. It might be that it's time finally after 20 years to revise, resuscitate the gen ed requirement. I mean, there can be a variety of things, and most innovations or most efforts to kind of improve what we're doing are best tied to something that the institution itself has now agreed, or some people agree is important. It could be a goal in the strategic plan. And often they'll start, and there needs to be some education. What is the DQP? Why should we probably? But it doesn't take long, especially with small groups of faculty working in a program area, to see the benefit, because it's providing that kind of structure. We called it a framework for them to ask questions about the areas represented in the DQP and say, do we agree with these? And oftentimes programs will have their own outcomes that line up.
Sure.
They might have different terms, but then typically what almost every program finds is, even though they say students should know and be able to do this, there are gaps. They are not being addressed. And that's when the funding, and that's when the DQP actually has value for a place, that they identified something they now in a concrete way can focus on. And then this brings us, I'm talking too much here, this brings us to where the learning actually takes place, which is in the context of the nature of assignments that faculty design. Where is it that we are asking students to do this work that's going to lead to that outcome? And there's an analog here for student failure that we were talking about earlier. We might talk about leadership, but what do you mean by leadership? And where are students evidencing? Where are they showing? Where are they demonstrating that they actually do these things precisely defined? I think there are great opportunities ahead for us, but we're not going to see, a university of 30,000 pick up the DQP and next year kind of walk off into the sunset and say, we did it. Right? This is an ongoing process.
Yeah, it sounds like it has to be integrated at many different levels, and it sounds like also adapted potentially to the context of the institution. But that if it's used effectively, it can tell the story of how that institution is doing what it says it does, right? Or what it espouses that it does. So
Being more clear to all parties involved.
yes.
You know, to students, to faculty, to staff, to employers, to the public, about what their commitments are. I mean, to me, that's at minimum, it's utility. It's a clearer expression of what we're after. But it's the, you know, George's comments just now really exposed this important element of reflection and benchmarking that you can do, just to say, are we even close to what other people are saying the educational experience of our master's or bachelor's or associate level students should be getting? Is an important exercise. We ought to be doing that kind of benchmarking. The only other piece that I found really interesting too, when you were offering some examples of where people dug in, is in this interesting 2-year, 4-year transfer issue. That which, you know, we're seeing students become so much more mobile, so much more building their own educational experience, moving from the 2-year sector to the 4-year sector. How are they supposed to make sense of their educational experience in that way? Wouldn't it be interesting if they could actually articulate the proficiencies that they gained when they were in a 2-year institution and now they're moving on to a 4-year? And shouldn't that build on that? So I think from a transfer perspective, this is really interesting. And there have been some institutions that have started examining that from a psychology program at a 2-year institution to a psychology program at a 4-year institution. Wow, the students at the 2-year are doing a whole bunch of work that really is supposed to be happening in the 4-year. So there's some interesting conversation about that. And then there's some interesting, just what skills have you learned as a transfer student? Do you have the things that we would really expect after 2 years of an associate program?
We just add to that I don't want you to leave the room thinking that this is kind of one by one individual institution activity. There are multiple institution projects going on around the country. AAC&U itself is running 2 that must involve 30 or 40 total institutions. The SHIOs, the state higher education officers, have a project going. So there are multiple things going on. There must be 100 institutions right now that are working in consortia kinds of arrangements. And this is very, very powerful when institutional partners get together. It can help sustain this kind of work.
I have so many questions about the DQ. But I'm going to ask about critics. Have you heard from critics, and have you responded? You know, who are the primary critics, and what are the concerns that they're raising if they're arguing?
Yes, and actually I would invite all of us to go to the current edition of the DQP, because there's a terrific appendix in there that begins to respond, or at least kind of, and I mean respond in an authentic way to some of the early reservations or criticisms. You know, one was, oh, you want every 2,500 institutions to do this very same thing. So there was there was the confusion between standards, levels of performance, and standardization. We're all going to do it right the same way. We got a good conversation at the end, as you know, of the previous session, where someone said there's nothing in here about interpersonal or intrapersonal competence, which of course resonates with us, and we worry about that. And the DQP will say, the book itself, right, the place where truth resides. If there are things that your institution emphasizes not represented here, add it. This is not to be the one size fits all. It's intended to be to provoke clear thinking and evidence-based decision-making about what's going on. Those are 2 things that came right out of the gate. There are other things. I mean, at first blush, people look at this and they can't make sense of it. And partly was the way the displays were used early on. They had a spider web and everything. Anyway, so they weren't minor points. They were significant points that I think this current edition of the DQP, remembering this has been out in the field being tested, experimented with. Now we're in our 4th. I say we, not collectively, in the 4th year. So lots of learning is taking place, and people know a little bit more about how to manage the work.
Well, what I think amazes me is that it's a broad national impact level initiative, right? So there's lots of folks involved, has the potential to really change what higher education looks like, feels like, and means, right? For not only the students who are there, but for stakeholders and governing boards and lawmakers and all of those who are concerned about what's happening within our
That's the
institution.
intention.
Yeah, and this, no bones about it, this has a strong equity agenda too. That this is supposed to be about ensuring that all students get the most out of whatever level of higher education they decide to pursue. And with some encouragement to do more versus less. So there's a very strong equity agenda here as well.
We've had a question from Twitter. Dr. Cindy Kane from Bridgewater State University is moving us back to this discussion about student engagement. She asks, what advice do you have for a student affairs professional looking to take what they know about student engagement into online spaces? So I don't know if she means in the context of online courses or online interactions with students, but how does this translate to a digital space?
I think it's a great question, but I actually, I think there's a lot of transferability.
Sure.
And in this, and the student engagement concepts aren't defined by the class or the course. I mean, they really are defined by the quality of relationship that you have with someone else there, and that can happen. I mean, it ought to be happening in an online experience as well. It's about access to services. It's about emphasizing support for your learning. I mean, all of those things ought to be happening in an online environment too, any sort of educational environment. So I think it transcends the environment. But the other thing is, I actually think online has some advantage in this way that face-to-face doesn't. Whereby that students who have committed to do an online education tend to be pretty committed to that experience and what they're about to do, without some distractions of the face-to-face learning environment. But the other thing is you can be a lot more intentional about how you design discussions and opportunities for students to interact with each other and opportunities for students to get feedback. I mean, you can be more intentional in an online environment sometimes than in a face-to-face environment.
And the flexibility of an asynchronous learning environment too allows for a different level of engagement potentially, especially for adult learners and others.
I mean, there have been some folks that have looked at this. I mean, EDUCAUSE and some other organizations have examined this even more thoughtfully and have really applied the same principles, but I think it transcends the environment.
I claim no expertise here, but I'll just kind of pair things that I've seen and heard. We know from NESI data, for example, that students who do all of their learning at a distance, that indicate that are as engaged on average or more engaged than the bricks and mortar on campus students, except occasionally for active and collaborative.
Yeah.
Right? So reading, tracking this, right?
But I wonder how much of that will change given the greater availability of online experiences. I think when that finding came out, it was really amazing because it was so strong and I think surprised people. But I think it had a lot to do with students who were choosing that pathway for their education.
The other thing I wanted to say, but Bill's right on that, and we have a colleague, Kurt Baum at Indiana University, who's been in the distance. He flies over what we're talking about. But he's written a book, I think, or probably several by now, like 101 ways to engage students at a distance. So this work is being done, and I think we'll find, as you're saying, for those people who are specifically addressing the kind of limitations that we've seen happen. Again, this narrow slice that Nessie did, they'll probably reverse that. It doesn't speak, I don't think, directly to what she was getting at the question, and I can't, because I.
That's a great question. Thanks, Cindy. If anybody else has questions on Twitter, please definitely tweet them to the hashtag #HigherEdLive, and if we'll get to questions from the audience here in a moment. I wanted to shift to a little bit to talking about first-year experience. Jillian, I've heard you talk about this, about the 5 principles of engagement for first-year students. Can you tell a little bit about what those are and why they're important?
Well, I've long had a strong interest in what happens in that first year because it really does set the stage for a student's experience beyond, particularly that first semester and what happens before they get into college and then particularly, again, that first semester. And I think between the work that the CESI, our counterpart, the Community College Survey of Student Engagement, and NESI has really discovered in all this, and then the decades of research and the good work that the National Resource Center for the First Year Experience has really, advanced significantly the structure and our thinking about the first year. It kind of boils down to these 5 factors that, I've kind of made a point in emphasizing in lots of different ways that, and they're not groundbreaking, they're just things that we ought to make sure that we can respond to. Things like, there has to be a strong start. But an institution has to be very clear about what it is it's trying to accomplish and what it's promising to students. And to do that before the student ever gets to campus So setting the stage for what's normal here, what do you do here, how are students engaged in this experience? So that strong start is first. The next, and then doing things like orientation. We know orientation makes a difference. We need to do it, we need to do it well. So that's the other thing, making sure that students get the support they need right away for any sort of lack of preparation they had when they were in high school. They need to get all of that at least addressed early. The second one is clear pathways. This has been a longstanding aspect of, or at least was one of the major findings from Project DEEP and everything we learned about how students need a very clear pathway. Giving students the smorgasbord of choices is not always the best route. We need to direct them towards the things that we know students at this particular institution need to do. So we need to know that ourselves. What do students, successful students at XYZ institution do? The next one is about integrated support. So building in more of the support into things like first-year seminar courses or into gateway courses that we know cause students trouble right at the start of their educational career. Instead of saying, oh, just go over there to the writing center, you can get your paper reviewed. That's not enough. We need to bring those peer tutors. We need to bring them into the space. Okay, so since you asked for the fact, I'm going to go I'm going to rattle off. The next one is high expectations. We have to believe that students can do this work and that all the students we've admitted are capable of doing this. And then we need to give them support to do that.
Or if we shouldn't admit them.
Yes, that's a huge issue, but we've admitted them, they're here in our space, and we need to do everything as much as possible to support them. And then the last one is, of course, I have to always end with this, is intensive student engagement. So we need to set students on the path to be intensely involved with their faculty, with their peers, getting feedback about their performance, talking with career advisors about their career plans, or faculty member, or in groups with peer tutors about that, or peer advisors about their career plans. So there are just some things that need to happen right away, and it's too important to leave it to chance. We can't just think that a student's going to figure this out on their own. Those habits are critical in the first year.
Do you have any institutions that come to mind that are doing this really well? I know.
Yes, there are lots.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna name them.
No,
Well, okay, so there are some that I think if you look at the practices, and all right, so I have to give Ohio State so much credit for this. They're always kind of my standout in this because they also have an incredible persistence rate too. So when we talk about, again, that very first question about what is it that causes students to persist, how do we know that they're learning what they need to know in order to be successful here? They've arranged it, they've organized, they've thought about what that 50,000 plus campus needs to do in order to make sense for first year students. And I think there are lots of places that have gone down that path to figure out, and then I've also named places like Southern Connecticut State University that has figured out how to do this in the first year and done it thoughtfully with a really challenging population of students.
And I think, at a place like Michigan State, you have a giant campus, right? So how can you do that in smaller pockets potentially? And so maybe there's models that could translate regardless of institutional type or student body size. Great. Wow, I can't believe how much time we're already through. So I have actually maybe two more questions, but we did receive another question from Twitter. Heather Horowitz from Philadelphia University asked the question, what are some recommended assessment techniques to directly measure student learning from engagement? Great question. Thanks, Heather.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it depends how you are interpreting that word engagement. And my argument would be, well, virtually everything that results in learning is a function of some form of engagement, right? So there are, I don't know what Heather's role is, Heather Horowitz. She may be focused primarily on classroom activities, but we could just stay with this kind of teamwork or leadership dimension that is somewhat familiar to us. What has really kind of been a very happy, I think, surprise to us as we've been monitoring what's going on nationally with assessment tools is a huge spike in what people call tools for assessing authentic student learning. And these take the form often of rubrics. So you could imagine that we would get together, some people would get together and say, a strong leader looks like this in terms of decision making, in terms of managing resources, in terms of being able to argue persuasively on behalf of a certain position. We could just kind of go down that list of the verbs that Jillian began to show us in the preceding session. And we invite you to check out that monograph by available on the well, a website, we could imagine setting up a rubric where we would then evaluate, if you will, the quality of the students, and I'm going to call it performance, or at least demonstrating those proficiencies in real life terms. That is, we're watching this person perform at a chapter meeting or a student government meeting, and we can do this with the work setting that Jillian mentioned. We could observe, we could even have students themselves do self-assessment, but we gotta know first, what are the proficiencies? How clearly can we define these skills and dispositions so that we have all of a better, more communal, common understanding of what we're looking for. Otherwise, we'll have stuff all over the waterfront. We're not specific enough for us to take action to improve.
I mean, I think that really draws the attention to some kind of organized institutional effort, right? So people are all coming together, discussing what they want to know, creating some kind of assessment tool that will get to them.
Most institutions, at least 85%, claim to have an umbrella set of outcomes for all their students.
Sure.
So our task in student affairs, for example, would be to say, given this umbrella, where do we contribute? It's not our job to contribute to every one of those, just like no single course that a faculty member teaches can possibly address all the outcomes that an institution says is important. So I do think taking what we have at the institution level, figuring out how that looks, where's our slice of action? And we should not hold ourselves accountable for trying to do everything. And there may be things, as we've already said, on that institutional, or not on that institution, that need to be reinterpreted, and we need to push them forward, because in all likelihood, institutions will say, we say that in the catalog, but we haven't mentioned it in our outcomes.
Yeah, I agree. And I wanted to get to my final question, because we're at 5:58, unbelievably, and I know we're lots of other things going on this evening. And I think, this is Student Affairs Live. We're here at ACPA, a conference primarily for folks who work around student learning and development. And I'm curious what your thoughts are specifically about how we can partner together with our colleagues across the institution to create these conditions that enhance student success and lead towards persistence to graduation. Like, that's kind of the ultimate, final thoughts on the best ways that we, from our vantage points, can contribute to this.
I have two. One is, I think it's really important for, from the perspective of student affairs, to be listening and thinking about what is being discussed on campus. That what's on the minds of, provosts and deans and associate provosts, people in the upper levels of leadership. What are they concerned about? What's being discussed? And then how can you make sure that you are responding and connecting to that bigger, larger concern on campus? So that's one very specific thing I think we often don't do enough of. We don't always look to see, how do I help resolve this issue and address this issue that's preoccupying the attention? The other one is, I think, being more out about, just being more clear and just stating what it is that we know about populations that are of interest. If your campus is talking about issues of equity or issues of access and concern of success for transfer students or veterans or whatever it is, we know a lot about those student populations. We need to be in there at the table.
Any final thoughts on that?
Just to reiterate, I think, to spin off of what Jillian said, there are priorities that institutions state. She gave the best answer, but I mean, what's in the strategic plan? What are we doing with Gen Ed? When are the accreditors coming? We need a common language so that we can talk with one another about things that we understand, but there are many things presently going on. The most important thing she said, I'll reiterate, and that is, who's got what kinds of questions about students here? And we need to know what those are. We may need to ask them, because they don't always kind of show up in ways that people that are public. So one of our roles may be to begin to ask those questions as we move around talking with our colleagues.
And sharing our story too. I mean, it's a collaborative process, and it should be where we're all at the same table. I really appreciate your time this afternoon. It's been fabulous to have an audience as well as our online audience on the internet. The session will be available for you to watch a recording later if you're interested. And that can be found on higheredlive.com. You can also go to higheredlive.com and browse our archives, subscribe to the newsletter, as well as download Higher Ed Live as a podcast on iTunes. So all kinds of ways to receive this free professional development tool made possible through our sponsorship by ACPA. So again, thank you to George and Jillian.
Thank you.
And thank you to my co-host Tony Duty, who's been running the tech behind the scenes, and to Joe Denise, who had a great connection with the Twitter piece. So thanks so much, and make it a great week.
Thank you.